Our next session is entitled Channeling Canadian Concerns, and it's quite a distinguished panel. As we will see over the next few sessions, when the crisis broke in the summer of 1979,
that I got out of the ark.
Were you there in 1979?
a lot of Canadians wanted to help. What was remarkable was the way the individual Canadians at different levels of society across Canada stepped forward and provided the leadership that gave shape to the form and effort that Canadians put in, from the highest levels of government and in the churches, synagogues, and neighborhoods. Chairing this panel session is someone that has already been introduced several times and is the co-chair of the conference, Mike Malloy. And Mike said, "Don't bother introducing me again." So Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I think that last session was really, really informative and helped show just how important the myth-making and the news are in this business. I just want to abuse my position here as chair of this session for a moment to introduce someone who's on the floor here who wasn't with us yesterday. You know, when you're trying to work your way through something complicated in the forest or in life or the city, it's the classic way to do that is to triangulate. And in the Refugee Task Force, when we were lost, which was our normal state, and we really wanted to figure out what the next move should be or how to solve a particular problem, we had 3 reference points. 2 of them are sitting here at the far end of the table, excluding the minister, of course. We would think about talking to Howard. We would talk to Bill, and we would talk to Ari Vanik. Ari Vanik is sitting there in the black leather jacket under the light. He was our main link with the Christian Reformed Church, and I always think of from where we sat in Ottawa, there was a 3-piston engine: the Mennonites, Operation Lifeline, and the Christian Reformed. If we got all those guys, if we knew where they wanted to go and they knew where we wanted to go, and we could synchronize it and come to some kind of a general agreement, the way was always clear. So I'd just like to welcome Ari. Today, or for this session, we are missing a 4th member of our panel, and it's a great shame. One of the most influential people in the early days in Ottawa, both in terms of mobilizing that population with its activist mayor, Marion Dewar, and also somebody who won the trust of those of us in government and had a lot of access to us, and someone to whom we listened, was Mr. Can D. Lee, who at one stage was the president of the Canadian Vietnamese Association, and who was also a moving force behind the efforts to build a Boat People Museum in Ottawa, something we hope will materialize in the next year or two. And Can had really hoped to be with us today, but like so many of us who were young pups at that stage, we're now old dogs, and occasionally things come along. So he sends his greetings, and we owe him a debt of gratitude. This session is, we've learned about how the media spread the word and how that message fell on fertile ground and how Canadians responded. You know, when Marion Dewar wanted to announced she was going to hold a meeting in Ottawa as the mayor, I was asked to come, and I helped put out 50 chairs, and we had to go out and find 400 additional chairs as the mob arrived, but that will needed to be shaped, and we're lucky today to have on our panel 3 of the people who shaped that direction. First of all, Professor and former Minister, the Honourable Ron Atke, who teaches law at the present time at Osgoode Hall and Western Ontario, Member of Parliament for 2 terms, and was our Minister of Immigration in 79 and 80, and took responsibility for the leadership of all our efforts on the as we got the movement going. I remember saying to Mr. Atke, he was kind enough at one stage to bring those of us in Ottawa to a lunch at Parliament Hill, which was not a very common thing for us junior civil servants in those days. Everybody, the matching crew, everyone was invited. And I was required to make the thank you speech, and I said, I want to thank you. We civil servants are used to being handed Volkswagens, and you have handed us a Cadillac to drive, and we're very, very pleased. So I'd like to ask the Honourable Mr. Atke to lead off our discussion.
Thank you, Mike, and to the other conference organizers for this wonderful invitation. Mike, I can remember having lunch with you about 6-8 months ago, and it was a nice sunny day. And your thoughts for this program were beginning to take shape, and you began to tell me about the speakers that you were going to have and the ideas you wanted to have and the contributions to history that you wanted recorded. And to see this come to fruition is a personal pleasure for me, and I think a tribute to you and York University and the Refugee Center here. And thank you for including me in this very interesting program. I'm not going to be long today, but I'm going to talk to you about some personal experiences and reflections which maybe give you a slightly different dimension than many other people in this room. I didn't get into the refugee game until June 1979, when I had won by a very narrow margin a constituency in the middle of Toronto called St. Paul's, and that was on May 22nd, 1979. And sometime between then and June 4th, I got a call from the Right Honourable Joe Clark, who had been Prime Minister, and he said, "How'd you like to become Minister of Immigration?" And I said, okay. It's not what I had hoped for. Maybe intergovernmental affairs, maybe justice, or something related more to my experience. I had done some immigration work in the large law firm that I was then a partner of in downtown Toronto at King and Bay, but it was a long ways removed from refugees. But when the Prime Minister calls and he has a specific portfolio in mind, you don't say no. Or can you have my second choice or something like that? I said, sure. And on June 4th, I became Minister of Employment and Immigration. And I never forgotten that day, and I think Howard has alluded to this. When I first got into the refugee movement, it was June 4th, 1979, and I was going to this department, this terrible building over in Hull Gatineau, which was then the department, and up to the ministerial office. And who should greet me at the elevator but Bud Cullen? I said, this is unusual. And I said, hi, Bud, because he was from basically the same area I was from, southwestern Ontario. And he had dated my older sister and was a friend. And I thought, this is going beyond. He said, I just wanted to introduce you to the department. And he handed me the keys to the car, introduced me to the driver, and that's the most important thing. And then he introduced me to the members of his staff. And he said, can I have a word with you for maybe a few minutes? And I said, sure. And we cut time in the agenda on the first day I was sworn in as minister. And he said, I just want to give you a heads up on a few issues that are percolating along. And he said, the first one is the boat people crisis. And I said, well, tell me about it. And I knew a little bit about immigration law, not much about refugee law. And so he gave me the background of the creation of the designated class and the sponsorship vehicles that were open. He gave me some of the information concerning the gravity of the crisis. He said, this is not going to wait. It has to be dealt with immediately this month, if not next month. And so he gave me the first total honest picture of the situation and the opportunities that existed for the incoming government. He didn't have to do that because he was a Liberal and I was a Conservative, but we were friends. And there was a tradition then that governments transitioned from one government to another, and there was a professional public service. And a lot of the partisan stuff that exists today didn't exist then. There was an element of goodwill, and that was helpful. In any event, I was transformed from being the Member of Parliament for St. Paul's, right in the middle of Toronto, to suddenly being Minister of Employment and Immigration. My first thought, I said, well, I've got all these employees. I think there were then 26,000. And he said, well, don't get worried. It works all right, and you've got a good deputy minister, Jack Mannion. But the immigration, in particular the refugee program, you should worry about. And it's not just you. You and your cabinet colleagues in your government should worry about this. And then he described to me some of the apparatus that existed. And he gave me some of the names, in addition to Jack Mannion, who had a good reputation for both the incoming government as well as outgoing government. There was partisanship even in those days because Mannion's uncle, I think, had been a leader of the Conservative Party back in the 1940s. So it was a good conservative name. But we were introduced to people called Cal Best and Kirk Bell and Mike Malloy, and there was this whole apparatus that we thought that existed. But more important, there was in place, and Cullen explained to me, the law was in place, the creation of the designated class, the sponsorship program, and the willingness of the public service in Employment and Immigration Canada to work with the new government if their objectives could be achieved. So I took that briefing. My next meeting was the next day with the new Prime Minister. And he and I were good friends, not the closest of friends, but good friends. I had backed Flora MacDonald in the leadership in 1976, so I was closer to her, but they had come together. And then suddenly I realized there was a commonality of interest here. Joe Clark had campaigned on the notion of community of communities, private-public partnerships, working together, the private sector and the public sector. And he had sought that in training programs, in some of the business partnerships, in some of the public works programs, and he saw that perhaps the refugee program could be adapted to that philosophical concept that had been put forward as part of his political campaign. And then I combined that with the interests of Flora, who was, after all, the first woman Minister of Foreign Affairs, or then called External Affairs, determined to make her mark, not just in Canada, but on the world stage. And there followed many meetings, particularly related to information coming in from the UNHCR and the growing and immediate crisis that existed in Southeast Asia. And her motivation at the time was not only to be the best woman Minister of External Affairs, but to lay a marker down for Canada in the world community, to shame the Americans and the Australians and the Germans and others into upping their intake of refugees to alleviate the problem in Southeast Asia. So for me, this was all of a sudden, called it in some sense a political storm. In another sense, it was just good luck. I had elected, I'd been given a portfolio that seemed interesting. I'd been given a briefing by a previous minister. I had a prime minister and a minister of external affairs who were allies and would play their role and would encourage me and I would encourage them. And then we made the immediate decision to increase the intake from 5,000 to 12,000, which was seen as a modest step in the first month of the program. The other thing that happened is I had the good luck to represent a constituency that had a home right in the middle of St. Paul's riding at 66 Wells Hill Avenue. That was the resident of a fellow who was called Howard Edelman. And Howard, he was a friend. He wasn't necessarily a conservative. And he had had a reputation on other issues. But suddenly there developed this notion of Howard Edelman is a go-to guy. And he's right here in my riding, 3 blocks from my constituency office. I mean, what more could a guy wish for? And then there emerged Operation Lifeline, and I didn't learn until this conference today that Operation Lifeline didn't come from Howard Edelman, it came from my department. That my officials had paid a visit to 66 Wells Hill Avenue and laid the groundwork for which became the most significant private sector coordinating operation that existed at that time. And that was, Howard, I think it was not more than a month that we had that famous meeting at Holy Rosary Church where the 50,000 program was laid out. And there was Howard and Operation Lifeline, 3 blocks from where you lived, right in the middle of the St. Paul's constituency. Now, what more could a guy ask for as a newly elected politician? So I was grateful for that. So in the one sense, I was lucky because I had everything falling in place in an area that a month previous I had not envisaged, I had not imagined. But I guess it's just a case of being in the right place in the right time. Now there weren't there were some problems that we had to deal with initially in cabinet. The initial increase from 5,000 to 12,000, that was easy, and in fact that's what Cullen advised because he said, you know, he was being held back by the Trudeau government who was concerned about being re-elected and didn't want to do anything that was seen as controversial. So we could do that easily, and the department was ready for that, but was it enough? And I think it's when Flora came back from New York and said, no, it's not enough, we've got to do something dramatic. And I give full credit to her for having the courage and the leadership to go to 50,000. There were objectors within cabinet. I can talk about it now. There were the usual objections from the Department of Finance, we can't afford it. From Treasury Board, how are we going to pay for it? And then there was one strong objection from the Minister of National Defense, the late Alan MacKinnon. And I found that strange, and I said, Alan, isn't this an opportunity for your department to sort of shine up there? He said, no, we can't afford it. We've got to buy more planes. We've got to buy more helicopters. We have the new fighter jets that have to be paid for. I was quite disappointed at that the military wouldn't then be seen as playing a particular role in this program going forward. Well, a funny thing happened. A week later, Alan MacKinnon came in, and he was all smiles. And he said, we're with you. Just tell us what we have to do. And I kind of have tried to figure out to this day what had happened, who had intervened. And I'm confirmed by my friend Mike Maloya that it was probably the fact we had the expertise of Jack Mannion, who was maybe the best deputy minister in the government of Canada at that time. And he'd gone to his counterpart over at the Department of National Defense and said, look, I've been through a number of other refugee movements, the Hungarian ones, and if you play it right, this can be really good for the Department of National Defense. And we'll do staging centers. They eventually did it at Griesbach Barracks and Edmonton and Long Point in Quebec. And the military, who didn't have much to do at that time except ask for more equipment, didn't have more. This would give them a human role and politically enhance the reputation of the Department of National Defense. And so there was this conversion before we made the July 18th announcement, and Department of National Defense was very much on side, and I pay tribute to them and the many men and women who were on the ground or who flew the planes. Even though they charged a lot, Mike, they were helpful in the final analysis. One other item that has been referred to is again, the role of Jack Mannion. He said, as I was loading up my briefcase on Thursday to go back to the constituency, and I was going to spend the weekend at the family cottage in Muskoka, and he said, stick this in your briefcase, and you've got a chance, have a look for it. Might be interesting. And it was a manuscript, then just in the course of being published by Irving Abella and Harold Troper, called None is Too Many. I learned later from Mike that he'd sent the same thing to members in his group, and said, have a look at it, and do you want to be Blair? Said both to the officials, and of course he was saying it to me. I'm not necessarily an original thinker, but getting to Cabinet Committee the next week, and Flora made her pitch, and then Clark said, well, Atke, what do you think from an immigration perspective? And I'd had yellow marked the passages in the book, and I said, well, let's just give you a little page out of history. This was before I was born, in the late 30s, and I did read that to cabinet colleagues, and I said, do we want to be known like Blair? And I put it in the we, and it's not a question if it's my way or the doorway. I didn't have that sort of clout. I was just a young guy, 37 years old, and these were all much older people, much more experienced. But I said, collectively, we have a responsibility here. And I think that resonated and sealed the deal, if you will, on the proposal that had come from Flora with the full backing of Joe Clark, who I'm very grateful to this day, and do a pitch for, if you want read a book that's useful in terms of describing how government proceeded in those days, buy Joe Clark's new book on foreign affairs, and he does a reflection based primarily on his time as Minister of Foreign Affairs for Canada, and it's available on the bookshelves and highly recommend it to you. In any event, we did jump to 50,000, and there was a lot of publicity, a lot of meetings around the country, and then in August, shit hit the fan. The National Citizens Coalition, well-funded by Colin Brown in London, Ontario, and some of his business colleagues, began to run advertisements saying that for every refugee that came in, there would be 15 more behind them, and that was changing the complexion and character of Canada. I responded at the time, I guess as a guy having to respond to the press, I said I thought it was racist, but that just spurred them on, and they ran a couple of more ads, fueled by a fellow called Kim Abbott, who I'd learned had left the department without universal support, and a degree of bitterness. And then Howard told you the story yesterday. The ads ran for a couple of weeks, and then they ended. I think that was as Howard put it, a bit of political kneecapping that took place in a discreet sort of way, with the Operation Lifeline playing a particular role. I've got to say a word about Operation Lifeline and why it was so useful politically. Because they weren't liberal, they weren't conservative, they weren't NDP, they weren't Catholic, they weren't Mennonite, they weren't Jewish, they were all of those things. Because they reflected Canadian society that existed at that time, or certainly rose to the surface at that time in a way that we were surprised, pleasantly. And we'd never seen that before. I think I see some of the references today to other times in our history of the Second World War, the draft dodgers coming to Canada. I might even go back to some of the initiatives of Sir Clifford Sifton at the beginning of the century in terms of immigration to Canada's west. But this was a unique circumstance that we didn't invent politically. We just happened to be there, having been elected under a democratic system on May 22nd, 1979. And suddenly we stumbled into this department that was geared up, ready to go. The law was in place, thanks to our Bob Andrus and our Liberal friends and Bud Cullen. The churches were there, out in front. The community was there. It has been an unparalleled experience. Certainly, I have never experienced anything like that in my lifetime, to be the beneficiary of participation by citizens, which in many ways was a politician's dream, but in many ways was a dream that was destined to some climb down, some negativism, and becomes a defining moment, for better or for worse. My own reflection historically is that it has been for better, and I'm proud to have played a small role in leadership in this program, in bringing a new government along based on the work done by others, and allowing the country to achieve an objective that perhaps had never been achieved before and remains a benchmark. And I do follow politics a little bit now, and I'm going to get questions about this later, and I hope there will be questions. First of all, what do you think about the present government? And my answer is no comment, except I'm going to say this about Jason Kenney. He may have been the best immigration minister overall that Canada has had. His old party, the Reform Party, is not one that I would support, but he has been able to achieve reforms within the refugee program, particularly in terms of speed, equity, and fairness to those who deserve to be treated fairly, and to eliminate the complex levels of appeal that slowed the system down to almost a halt. So I give him full marks for that, and he achieved where others have tried and failed. That's speaking historically, recent history. The other thing I'm encouraged about is the current Minister of Immigration, Citizenship and Immigration, is Chris Alexander. Chris was a poll worker for me in St. Paul's. He lived, like Howard, in the middle of the riding. His parents were very good friends of mine, and I continue to see him socially and support him politically. He is, unlike most in the current government, from the Reds-Tory side of things. And he's young. He was our ambassador in Afghanistan for a period and then worked with the United Nations in trying to work out arrangements in Afghanistan. And I have great hope in him leading the way for the future. So all I can say at this point, without passing final judgment, is watch him closely. He's kept under strict control by the PMO, as are most ministers. But nevertheless, I think he's one to watch for. And so there is hope for the future. And if you need help within the current government, as long as it lasts, Chris Alexander is a person that you might want to go to and see what can be achieved. And he has a history of supporting causes such as the Indo-Chinese refugee program. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, Minister. Old habits die very hard. Our next speaker will be Dr. Bill Jansen. Bill grew up in Saskatchewan. He's a master's degree in international affairs and in religious studies, as well as a PhD in political science. He has served as the director of the Ottawa office of the Mennonite Central Committee from 1975 to 2008, working on a very broad range of issues, including refugees, development, and foreign policy, particularly in relation to Southeast Asia and the Middle East. He's also represented the MCC at various interchurch and other coalitions, and he has served in the Congo and Egypt under the MCC for several years. And Bill was as I mentioned earlier, was one of the people that we took our beads off when we were trying to figure out what to do. And I'm just delighted that he's here. We've fought on the same side in a number of battles since, and I regard him as a great friend. So, please.
Thank you for those very generous words, Mike. It's been my privilege. My primary involvement in this rather big story relates to the drafting of the first master agreement for the private sponsorship of refugees. That was early in 1979. It was not my only involvement. There were other issues that emerged in the coming weeks and months and years, decades, that I was involved with, but I will focus primarily on this involvement, which was, for me, a significant chapter at that point. How did it happen? In late January of 1979, MCC held its annual general meeting in Calgary, And by that time, as you will know, the boat people crisis featured strongly in the news. There were boats, big and small, that were disgorging their human cargo on the shores of Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and other places. And many Mennonites in Canada, whose own experience as refugees was well within living memory, felt compelled to respond. I was then instructed at that annual meeting to go back to Ottawa and to work with senior immigration officials to negotiate the best possible way so that Canadian Mennonite churches could respond. The officials in Ottawa proved remarkably open. We met on February 2nd. John Wheeler, from whom you will hear this afternoon, came from our head office in Winnipeg, together with Arthur Dreger. And from the immigration side, there was Cal Best, I think he was Associate Deputy Minister, Kirk Bell, and Gordon Barnett. We talked, and the basic principle of the master agreement emerged quickly. The law at that time allowed any 5 Canadians to sponsor a refugee if they, in addition to accepting the practical responsibility of getting them settled, would also accept the full liability for those refugees. It was this liability question that made many people hesitate. What the master agreement did was that it enabled the national organization, namely Mennonite Central Committee Canada, to accept that liability on behalf of the sponsoring congregations across Canada. Those congregations, large or small, would then do the actual work. What this also meant was that if a congregation, Mennonite or other, say in small town Saskatchewan, where I come from, would get an authorization letter from Mennonite Central Committee Canada and take it to the nearest immigration office, then those immigration officials would swing into action to get the refugees. Those officials would not then first have to check out whether this group was creditworthy. The swift involvement, the swift movement of things was also helped greatly by the fact that just 2 months earlier, the government had made the Southeast Asian boat people a designated class, as Mike mentioned yesterday. After that meeting on February 2nd, Gordon Barnett and I were given the task of drawing up the actual agreement. We got together several times over the next week, checking with our respective colleagues while we moved along. And in addition to the question of liability, there were also issues of how communications would flow from MCC Canada head office to the provincial organizations, to the congregations, and to the immigration head office, and to the local, to Post Abroad, and so on, and communications going back and forth and so on. So there were some complexities. Still, we completed our work quickly, and very soon the board of MCC Canada approved the agreement, and then on March 5, when the minister, Bud Cullen, came to Winnipeg, there was a small signing ceremony with Bud Cullen, the minister, and our executive director, J.M. Clausen. From that point on, John Wheeler, Arthur Dreger, and our provincial MCC offices carried the ball, together with the churches of Canada who did the actual work. And as the record shows, they did an awful lot of it. Within the next several weeks and months, I think 15 other national church bodies had signed virtually identical agreements with the government, and so did some other non-church bodies. I would like now to discuss some elements in the context and background that help to explain why MCC took this step. One, already alluded to, is the experience among many Canadian Mennonites of being refugees. Approximately 21,000 had come from the Soviet Union in the 1920s, before Canada had closed its door, thanks in part to the opposition of some provinces. leaving a much larger number of Mennonites behind. After World War II, another 7,000 came. They were among the 30 million that Mike referred to yesterday, 30 million refugees, 30 million people in Germany who were refugees when the shooting there stopped. But again, while 7,000 got to Canada, a much larger number of Mennonites were forcibly returned to the Soviet Union under the big power agreements of that time. So yes, many Canadian Mennonites knew firsthand what it was like to be refugees. They also knew about life under communist governments and how harsh and oppressive it could be. Canadian Mennonites also knew about cooperating with the government on immigration matters. In fact, the big movements after World War I and again after World War II had involved arrangements similar to the private sponsorship agreement of refugees, in the sense that the established Mennonites in Canada had to accept responsibility for getting the incoming Mennonite refugees settled. Also, in post-World War II Europe, Canadian Mennonite workers worked very closely with Canadian officials in Europe to identify people for resettlement in Canada. Thus, cooperation with the Canadian government on bringing in refugees was not new. And interestingly, for a while at the height of the Southeast Asian boat people movement, MCC even had a desk inside the Canadian Embassy in Bangkok to work cooperatively with to facilitate the movement. There's one other element in the context that I feel should be noted. It is that MCC had a history with Vietnam. MCC had been working there since 1954. Not MCC Canada by itself, but together with MCC in the United States. Indeed, it was American MCCers that often took a leading role in this work during those years of the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. And under the umbrella of that binational MCC, there was a fairly critical stance, as you will not be surprised, about the American war effort, how brutal, murderous it sometimes was. And sometimes those criticisms, particularly from American workers, but also from some Canadian workers, were countered rather strongly by Mennonites in Canada who told stories about fleeing communist governments in Russia and about the evils of communism and how it needed to be resisted. So not everybody in the Mennonite community was on the same page when it came to Vietnam. MCC's work in the 1960s had been mainly in South Vietnam. That was where it was easier to work politically, legally, and so on. But there were at least a few efforts, there were a few shipments of medical supplies to the north, partly to help, but also as a signal of saying, at least to ourselves and to others, that we were not totally taken up with one side of that tragic conflict. In their spirit also, MCC continued some work even after the fall of Saigon in 1975, specifically with flood relief work assistance. Vietnam, because of its geography, is very vulnerable to floods and storms. And in those years, in the second half of the 70s, Vietnam had an embassy in Ottawa. And I went there a number of times to negotiate flood relief shipments to Vietnam, and also to negotiate arrangements so that delegations from Canada could visit Vietnam to oversee what was actually happening. In those years, the government of Vietnam did not allow us to have personnel stationed there, but they would allow visits, so we arranged that for that to happen. We also, throughout the 1980s, pleaded with the Canadian government to let us use CETA money in Vietnam and Cambodia, as we were doing in dozens of other countries. And I find it an interesting coincidence that I can report here that it was around 1990 that the Right Honourable Joe Clark, in his role as Canada's foreign minister, approved the use of CETA money in Vietnam and Cambodia, just as he had earlier approved the work with the boat people when he was Prime Minister 1 decade earlier. There have been several references here at this conference to moral dilemmas. For MCC, this effort to respond to the people in Southeast Asia in these different ways was, in a sense, our effort to deal with those moral dilemmas. I would love to refer also to cooperation with other churches. As Mike has mentioned, Ari Van Eek is here from the Christian Reformed Church, so is Tom Clark, who led the Interchurch Committee on Refugees for many years, but those comments will have to wait for another occasion. Thank you.
And now I'm going to introduce a new speaker, a gentleman by the name of Howard Edelman, who you may have heard of at some stage. I don't think we need to put a long introduction. We all know who he is. Howard, please take the podium.
The question, I'm going to talk about the origins of Operation Lifeline, but the key question I want to raise is why then, and the implication is why not now? One of the reasons then is, I think, an experience we had in Canada, which wasn't of multiculturalism, it was of multipoliticism. And this was true in the nuclear disarmament campaign when I was head at the University of Toronto of the Combined Universities Campaign Against Nuclear Arms. It was true of the work we did in the South against racism in the United States, with the Student Union for Peace Action. It was true of Praxis. We had organized a research institute in the 70s in which Sewell was one of our first workers who became a street worker, which involved people from the left, conservatives, liberals. It was non-political, denominational. We were considered subversives, and the Mounties burned us down. And our files ended up on the desks of Peter Worthington at the Sun, but we weren't. We were an activist organization which tried to embrace across the spectrum. That heritage, I think, is important. A second kind of thing that can be contrasted is we came late to the refugee movement as a public arising. And you can do the comparison. The Mennonites were certainly earlier, but compare it to the United States. In the United States, the International Rescue Committee had been active in 77. The Citizen Commission on Indo-Chinese Refugees that they organized. The early editorial in the New York Times that started pushing the Carter administration to do more. All that was going on in the United States, and there was no equivalent in Canada. So they had a citizens' movement. Just for example, the 89 leaders of the African American organization endorsed this work for the Indo-Chinese refugees. They had a significant big public movement. But one of the differences is that they had divisions, and the big division on the left. We didn't experience that, partly because we were united in responding to receiving the American refugees and draft dodgers, but partly because of what the left was there. Noam Chomsky was not sympathetic to taking refugees and was distinctly silent on it. Francis Fitzgerald, William Kunstler, Jane Fonda. Jane Fonda criticized openly and attacked Joan Baez when she wrote a letter saying they had to do something and organize something. They started fighting with each other, and Jane was in the lead on that. So they had divisions which we didn't have. And this was a unity that united people from all sides, And it percolated in a number of ways. And it was different than, say, in Australia. In Australia, you had a situation, which I've alluded to before, of racism. And it was in the government, it was in public opinion, etc. You had a poll there. We talked about 52% opposing refugees here. That was the underlying thing that wasn't articulated very well. In Australia, they had 61% wanted to strictly limit the refugees. But what you also have to know is 28% wanted it to be reduced to zero. The ones who wanted the reduction were the good guys. There were the bad guys were the one who didn't want a single one in. We didn't have that phenomenon here. We didn't have a phenomenon of on both parties really resisting refugees in Australia. We had a unity and a unitary principle and an expression of compassion. So when I came down after being up at my island and been writing for 6 weeks and encountered this whole mass of 6 weeks of stories that had been occurring that I had read and knew anything about, and had brought with me this article I had written on the non-reception and resistance to taking Jewish refugees in the United States, Canada, and Britain, because books were now coming out on this subject, and I did this review article, then one couldn't help wanting to do something and say never again. And so when I called a meeting for my house on that Sunday and called the local, there's a priest up the street where you announced the 50,000 at the Catholic Church, whom I knew, invited to the house, the 2 rabbis at Beth Tzedek and Holy Blossom, the Anglican Church minister I happened to know up on Bathurst Street, and the United Church minister who couldn't come sent one of his parishioners. Everybody who was invited came. I always thought Ron sent told Andre Pilon and Bob Parks, who was here, to come to the house on a Sunday afternoon. But you evidently said you didn't do it, but I had believed you'd done it. So I went and checked back, and it turns out it appears that the way it happened, Ying Hope was our alderman. He was a Tory. And Ying Hope, evidently, I just found this out, evidently phoned, the department was referred to Andre, and that's how Andre learned about the meeting and took the initiative to come to the house. But just think of it, civil servants deciding to come to a private house that they're not invited to, knocking on the door and saying, can we come in? That's how it starts. We knew nothing much about none of us, about the Indo-Chinese refugee movement other than what was appearing in the press. And we wanted to write a letter to tell Ron, come on, get off your ass and do a lot more. That's what the purpose of the meeting was. And he was our member of parliament, so we thought we would have some influence over him. Well, it was Andre who convinced us, well, look, isn't it better if you actually do something and the law allows you to do something? You can do some witnessing. And of course, especially the Christians in the room, the idea of witnessing appeals very strongly. And we all thought it was a great idea, and we forgot about the letter. So Ron never got a letter from us. And we decided we'd sponsor 50 people over the summer and that we'd do our good thing and then go home. Now, the chance factor that Ron referred to in his own situation happened there because one of my graduate students wanted to work with me on his thesis. And I said, look, I only have this short time in Toronto. Come to the house, come to the meeting, it'll be interesting for you. And as soon as it's over, we'll work on your thesis, which we did. What I didn't know is he was a stringer for the Globe and Mail. He never told me that. He evidently phoned the Globe and spoke to Dick Beddoes. Dick Beddoes then wrote a whole column the next day in the morning paper. I didn't read it first. I had it read to me. I'll tell you the story. He wrote this whole column in the paper, and essentially it was a total mythological story about this philosophy professor who set aside his philosophy and his commitment to Hegel, he called it Haeckel. There is a German philosopher, Haeckel, but it wasn't mine. As if he came down from his island up in the north and donned a white horse and a white Stetson to save all these boat people, which I didn't do. I didn't come down for that purpose, had no intention of doing it, etc. And he said, he named it Operation Lifeline. He gets all the credit for the name. He put in Operation Lifeline. We didn't call ourselves anything. We were just a constituency riding association getting together to help support sponsorship in the various synagogues and churches. Anyway, he named us Operation and put my phone number at the bottom of the column. At 6 a.m. the following morning, almost to the dot, even though the time difference is an hour and a half in Newfoundland, 6 a.m. I get a call, and I'm at my desk early, and a woman gets on the phone. I says, I want to help Operation Lifeline. And I said, what's Operation Lifeline? What are you calling me for? Anyway, she said, well, there's this number, your number's in the paper, and she told me the story, and so I asked her to read me the column. She read me the column, and I said, okay, you're the chair of the Marystown chapter of Operation Lifeline. If we were going to be an organization, it was the kind of techniques of organizing we did in the 60s. So it's the kind of techniques that Naomi talks about of the refugee liaison officers using, the kind of street politics where you use informal networking techniques. You don't check everybody out. It's not hierarchical, etc. And so we'd been used to those kinds of techniques of organizing. And after 15 minutes, she said, but I'm just a housewife. I don't know what to do. I said, just call your local minister and your local member of parliament, whoever you know, tell them to come over to the house, and we'll send you a package on what to do. Of course, I had no idea what to do. I had never been involved in this. But I hung the phone up, and it rang again. And this is about 6:15, and it never stopped ringing for 2 weeks. It literally, every time you put the phone down, it rang, and it was some other kind of call. And within 10 days, we had 68 chapters across the country in this fast way of organizing. But people, because they couldn't reach us on the phone, arrived at the door. So, that, for example, at 9:30 in the morning, 2 Ugandan Asians arrived at the door. This is the story in the paper. They had to find out where I lived and all this. They arrive at the door and have this bundle of cash in their hands and said, here, we want to help the boat people. And I said, well, you'll sponsor them. We don't take any money. We're not in the money-raising business. And they agreed to sponsor refugees and to take the money and started. It happened that way. People were just ready to do something, and we merely provided a vehicle. It became an important vehicle. And Sewell came around and offered us space to get, because the house was overflowing with volunteers. Every room in the house was occupied with people. And he gave us space in City Hall, and then the federal government gave us space in the Welcome House building. And so you began to build an organization. And all kinds of people came forth. For example, Murray Koffler from Shoppers Drug Mart. He was a little contingency factor. I happened to deliver drugs for him when I was 13 years old and got fired when an inspector came around and found I was underage and couldn't work as a delivery kid. You had to be 14 years of age to be employed. And I was so mad at that rule. But so I had known him and phoned him up, and he had a sort of ranch north of Toronto and came down early in the morning and volunteered everything and helped organize, insisted I was wrong and didn't know we would need money, and raised $500,000 for Operation Lifeline as a kind of backup fund for sponsors. It was that kind of spontaneous outpouring of various skills that came forth. Now, I want to ask the question then, why did it happen then? Well, I think there's a bit of this history. And there's various theories if you read the literature. The main one, which I've been trying to debunk, is that the people pressured the government to do this. And I think it's just fraudulent. It's not true. It isn't what happened. The government here in Canada was ahead of the population. The civil servants were ahead of the population. There was certainly compassion that was at work. A second factor was indeed the willingness to people not just to feel things, but to engage in self-sacrifice. Because after all, 5 families get together, it could cost you $12,000, $15,000 to sponsor families. So it wasn't a small kind of commitment. It was a significant commitment. Could cost more, could cost less, but that was the average, we figured. And so you had to be willing to sacrifice to some degree. And the sacrifice in money was just part of it. It was the time sacrifice, spending time, taking the refugees around, doing all the rest. But it was very rewarding, but it did require those things. We heard just before me about the sense and memory of being a refugee and the sense of what you could do. And in my own research on my own book was to discover how important that was in differentiating the different response of different groups. There is the contingency factor I spoke of, chance factors. One of the chance factors that when I was in graduate school, a fellow graduate student in philosophy went on to law. He got his master's degree and went into law. And I hadn't seen him since. He'd been trying to reach me on the phone that Monday, and he arrived at the house at 5:30 with a whole, those black briefcases the lawyers carry, full of documents about sponsorship, because he had been pushing his United Church congregation since February to try to get them to sponsor, and they wouldn't do it. There was resistance. And I know there was an element of racism as I went to some churches and found that out, and Tom Clark knows far better about this than I do. But they came on side fully eventually, but it took time. But he had all this prepared, and we spent all that Monday night till early in the morning. In the early morning, we had a 62-page pamphlet ready to tell people, here's how you sponsor. We send it out to Marystown and anybody else, and that became the paper way of organizing Operation Lifeline. So there was kind of knowledge factor that goes into it. There was this organizing factor that I had and brought to the table. There was the kind of astuteness that a guy like Joseph Wong brought to the table, that everybody knows he has the order. He's done an enormous amount if you don't know him, and no one can resist him once he gets involved in something and wants you to do something. There's a very great commitment to this kind of event. And for example, we encountered within the ethnic Chinese community, the Hong Kong Chinese, his group of young professional Hong Chinese that now started the Hai Hong Nursing Home Syndicate. And now the biggest nursing homes in Toronto arrangement were started by Joseph Wong. Not the Hai Hong. What's the name? Ying. What's the? Yi. Right. Yi Hong. Those kinds of organizing skills and abilities that went into it. But we found out when we did it that the ethnic Chinese in downtown Toronto didn't want the ethnic Chinese from Vietnam. We were so shocked, and this is Joseph too. We went down, we did a survey, we went around to the restaurants and asked the people why. And they said, because they'll compete with us jobs and getting jobs as waiters, etc. So you have funny kinds of resistances that come from different places that make it a much more complex matter than you think at first. But these kinds of talents that came together were the big effective things. So it didn't matter that 52% of the people were opposed. You could find that all the people who wanted to do something, the opposition was relatively passive. The very active one, we took care of by the rich guys, as we called, decapping them. But the activity was by every organization. I think every single professional organization passed the motion, the architects, the engineers, the doctors, you name it, saying, we endorse the sponsorship program, we want to get involved, we give some money, etc. The whole virtually middle class of Canada, professional classes, the business leadership, came together on this kind of thing, and that made a big difference. History made a big difference, our not attachment to the war effort, and suddenly making a stance about Vietnam that wasn't either anti-American or anti-communist, because we didn't want to be identified as doing things simply because of anti-communism. This culture that Joe Clark came with, that Ron mentioned, of business, private-public partnerships, of a community of communities, of trying to involve the public and the private together. The fact that at that time, we believed in public service. We believed in a civil service. And we believed in responsible government, that government wasn't just about doing the least that they had to, but there was a government that had a responsibility to do things and that ran across the political spectrum, so that there was trust, basically, in the civil service and in government, even about when there were political differences. That there was a sense further of civility in the society that had been part of the long heritage of Canada, even when it was a racist country, because we inherited that civility. We also inherited a kind of an astuteness in Canada about getting things done. This is a whole different side of research. Canada has been terrific in entrepreneurship, believe it or not. We're not good in keeping the entrepreneurship and transferring into making sure we have world-class corporations that last. And there's a whole explanation some people have for it, going back to when we had the best fire engine at the World Fair in the 1870s, and why we lost out to the Americans in manufacturing that fire engine. And the same things seem to come again in some of the weaknesses in Canada, where we don't take advantage of some of the creativity we have. But the main message I would suggest is it was a combination of factors. And without all that combination, it doesn't happen. And some of the factors that people say that will work, particularly public pressure, just wasn't there at all. That wasn't the reason it happened, and thank you.
Okay, we've got about 20 minutes, and I think what would be useful at this stage is if we go directly to questions and comments from the floor, and I'll ask the panelists to pick up the things they're interested in, and people making comments and whatnot. Let's keep it succinct and focused, okay? Sir, please begin.
Briefly, I hope. My name is Michael Creel. I'm a retired professor of humanities at this university, and still tolerated, I hope, as a member of the Center for Refugee Studies here. I just want to add a small footnote to this remarkable narrative that's emerging out of this conference. In 1979, I was master of one of the colleges here at York Vanier College, and Howard is a colleague. I went to Howard and I said, what do you think about a college sponsoring a refugee family? Howard said, why not? So I gathered a meeting of students and fellows of the college, and we agreed almost immediately to finance the sponsorship of the family. So I went ahead with the procedures. We found a family of 5, a young couple in their 20s and 3 kids, and they arrived at the airport. They didn't speak any English. I didn't speak any Vietnamese or Mandarin. We did exchanged a lot of smiles for the next 2 weeks as we began to get to know each other. The family have since become very close friends. In 2 weeks, I'll have a dinner with a couple of them. One of them is they're 2 young women. One is an civil engineer, very successful. The other just returned from the London office of BMO, of RBC rather, in the bond department. And I just want to say that these people, and we've developed a little project called Sanctuary North, bringing refugees from Toronto, downtown Toronto, give them a larger sense of the country. And Mélène, one of the refugees, contributes $1,000 a year to the operation of Sanctuary North. I'm just telling this story because Canada is hugely enriched by their presence, by the presence of this family. And I know this story can be duplicated over and over again. So that's my story.
Jennifer.
That's a hard act to follow, Michael. I have just one point of contention. I want to first say, and then two reflections on how we can bring the lessons learned back to the present moment. We are just sitting here reflecting on and looking at a kind of, anyway, a panel of people who 30 years on are still involved and committed to resettlement and refugee issues and I think protection. And I just want to make, with all due respect, former Minister Atke, I would say that you are the most impressive Minister of Immigration and Employment that we've had in this country. And I would just like to make that reflection. However, I can't resist going on to say why I have two concerns about the current situation, not the former minister specifically, but I think two things are happening. One, space for refugees and their protection is shrinking. In this country, 20,000 people per year have historically been coming as resettled refugees, GARs, privately sponsored, and landed in Canada refugees. This year, those numbers will be probably about half of that. On a broader global scale, we have over 10.5 million refugees in the world, 7.2 million, 2/3 of whom are stuck in protracted situations. So yes, it's important that we select them and bring them here. I think it's very charitable of us, but we need to get beyond charity, and we need to remember that protection is important. No government, until this government, has done more to shrink the amount of space for protection of refugees than this government. And there's any number of biometric projects. Many of you have heard of the new biometric project, whereby people from 29 countries in one territory will have to deposit their biometrics when they apply for a visa. And if you happen to belong to one of those 29 countries, even, Dr. Jantz, who for 30 plus years has worked in this field as a person, all of you here would have to apply by depositing your biometrics before applying for your visa so that you can be, refused if you belong to one of these refugee-producing countries. So there are lots of reasons that we have to be very wary. And the second thing I just want to bring up is we're reflecting on such a positive moment, and how can we, again, take those lessons learned? I just want us to think carefully that we don't privilege resettlement over, to the neglect of the landed in Canada system. That's where Canada remains a world leader. We are also a leader on the resettlement side, but I think we have to be very careful not to privilege the resettled refugees over those who might come here from Sri Lanka, because there is no adjacent country for them to land in. And I think that's very important that we don't reproduce a bias that the former immigration minister, CIC minister in this country, has created: the good refugees, resettled refugees, the bad refugees, those who come here on their own.
Would anyone like to comment on anything?
I would. Let me disagree with our current director. The disagreement is this, and it came out in the excellent lecture we had this week, a really superb lecture on a recent case on exclusions. And what came out of the lecture was an analysis of the exclusion clause, the new exclusion clause, the exclusion clause in the Refugee Convention that says who can be excluded on what grounds. And there was a case that, in fact, in the Supreme Court that said you couldn't exclude in the way the Canadian government was doing it. And so it was a victory for the refugee support system and the asylum system. But as the person delivering the lecture, a professor of law from UBC, said, what comes out of it, we won the battle, but in fact, the war is being lost. She offered a couple faint hope possibilities of two kinds of tweaking around the edges to get the government to bend a bit on the asylum process. My analysis is somewhat different. that says that's all true, but I was told here, I think it was you who told me, that the Mennonites initially opposed the Singh going to the government for the Singh, which I supported fully. But one of the changes that has happened is that since the 80s, it's not a balanced procedure. Overwhelmingly, money and human energy has gone into the asylum process and not the resettlement process. Overwhelmingly. The attention of scholars, the attention of agencies, etc. So rather than saying the balance has to be kept, the fact is the balance hasn't been kept. And part of the fault is, I think, on our side of the refugee support sector. To figure out a method whereby the asylum process can be judicious and fair and right at the same time as the big number of refugees who are humanitarian refugees, which are by far the largest number, can be taken care of. But I think that's a debate we have to have among us scholars and among us refugee support community in a discussion that looks at all the angles of it and comes to some kind of consensus and approaches the government with a sense of a reasoned position instead of dealing with them as the enemy. Thank you.
Yeah, just a very small correction. My personally, I had some misgivings about that Singh initiative, that effort. It wasn't that Mennonites as an organization opposed it.
Sir.
Sometimes when you're standing here for some time and waiting to talk and you lost your question. You couldn't remember things. I just want to say my very excellent complimentary to Mr. William Jensen of your excellent job of helping refugees in your organization. I just want to let you know there were so many Laotian Christian and monk become a Christian and to grow to be the church is because of you. And thank you very much for that. The question I want to ask you, as you mentioned about your mission, your sponsorship to help refugees to come to Canada has been long overdue, a long time ago. Now, but your mission is not stopped there. I know your mission to going back to Vietnam, especially to my country of Laos. I knew that your mission is still there in the northeastern part of the Laos. I wonder, are they still there? If they are still there, how well you receive your cooperation from the government and from the people in that area? What your people doing there is just to help the people to rescue the bomb that they've been dropping for so many years. And I know that they are doing very excellent job. And then if you're still there, and how long are you going to be there? And that's what is my question. And thank what you have done for my country.
Thank you. I have been retired from the organization since 2008, so I can beg off, but I know that the organization is still active there. And I also am virtually sure that the relations with those governments remain delicate. That's, I think, the nature of it. There is work going on. I don't know the details of the kind of thrusts, but certainly the matter of bomb disposals, cluster bombs, and so on, and technology, simple tools to help farmers to identify those bombs where they before they get their legs blown off. That has been there and is continuing. There are several other people who are on staff with Mennonite Central Committee now who are in the audience if they wish to say something. If not now, then later on. But thank you for your question and your comment.
Can I ask a subsidiary small question? What's the percentage of Mennonites in Canada?
By the population, I think we're close to 300,000.
300,000, so what, 2%?
1%.
1% of the population probably springs over and sponsors, quite aside from their overseas work, probably 12.5% of refugees, something like that. It just says how outstanding the Mennonite work is. Our unique here is the Christian Reform is very similar, very disproportionate work in relationship to their numbers.
Yes, my question is very short. Yeah, you know, when I listened to Professor Howard said that, why then and why is not now? So then I remember about the compassion, energetic, and ignite in 1979. Right, we opened the own power scene machinery. We extended the integrity and the competency of Canadian government officials and people, and we make very much different for the worldwide humanitarianism. Now, why compassion fatigue? So we can talk about a short story from quote in the Bible. You know, Madame Ruth, lawyer Ruth. Yeah, her mom said that, Ruth, come back to your country. And Madame said that, Mom, your country is my country. Your nation is my nation. Your town is my finally destination too, right? So therefore, in the name of compassion or generosity of Canadian immigration and refugee policy, the invitee, the heart, both of them need competency, tolerance, generosity, and integrity. I think so. That is the main difference. Thank you.
Thank you very
The
much.
lady over there, I don't know what her name is,
Hi.
but her initials are Laura Metacoral.
Good memory. Thank you very much for the presentations. I wanted to ask about differences across the country, and I was thinking in particular of Quebec. I don't know the story of Quebec and the Indo-Chinese refugees as well, but I know that the federal-provincial relationship has always been an interesting one. And so I guess my question is for Minister Attke, whether there was any kind of discussion about what the response would be in Quebec, whether the provincial government had made some kind of initiative to help the refugees.
To be honest with you, I don't recall any significant distinction. There was some concern that would Quebec numbers fall below the rest of Canada, or ROC as we used to call it. But my recollection is that the numbers were relatively evenly balanced across the country. Howard might want to comment on that in terms of chapters of Operation Lifeline. Did you have chapters established in the province of Quebec?
There was a Montreal organization, but the reality was in Quebec, unlike the rest of Canada, the provincial government took a far more activist role on behalf of refugees than across the rest of Canada, and that made a difference. So that the private sector didn't do as much in Quebec, though probably in the English Anglophone Quebec they did in the same proportion as the rest of Canada, but they relied much more on the state, in that case the province, carrying the burden and doing the main carrying the main weight, and that's why it was roughly the same in the end.
I do want to share a story with you, and it was about one of our ham-handed efforts to try to engender or maintain public support for the program. And Howard and I have talked about this. We, at the height of the National Citizens Coalition advertisements, we decided that we needed to establish an advisory committee on refugees. And the two groups that we perceived as support was faltering from was the business community and some of the Catholic community, particularly in the province of Quebec. So in our ham-handed way, we established an advisory committee on Indo-Chinese refugees, chaired by that paragon of virtue within the business community at that time called Conrad Black. And the reason we chose Conrad is he had spent some time in Vietnam, and I knew him when we went to high school. And Cardinal Leger, who was seen as a pillar of the Roman Catholic Church within Quebec at a point when the church was still of significant influence within the province of Quebec. I think the best that can be said about that advisory committee, it had some small effect in terms of a rather small report that was produced, and the fact that it existed was seen by some as significant. But it was one of the things that you do in government if you see public support starting to wane. You try to shore up, and the Quebec community, particularly the Roman Catholic community in Quebec, was seen as one that was faltering at the time. Whether that is borne out by the numbers, I'd turn to somebody like Mike Malloy, who would have been tracking that.
Yeah. The relationship with Quebec operationally was complicated, but it was actually quite fruitful. One of the problems for us in Ottawa was that there were two voices. There was the MIQ, the Ministry of Immigration of Quebec, and then there was a lady who was le délégué pour les réfugiés, and she was a kind of very, very serious person, but a bit of an unguided missile, and in fact would come to Ottawa and lay out what we thought, until we learned, the Quebec government's demands or policies, and we'd go to work on them and then discover that the people in the Quebec Immigration Ministry had never heard of it. And the one example of that is what were called the Pagoda people, who, for reasons that escape me now, we had to, I guess with IOM help, bounce up through Moscow to Paris, where our gang there gave them a quick once-over, and then on. And we got it all. It was a bit complicated to establish, as you might imagine. So we get it all done. We're all ready to go. We go call up one of my counterparts in the Quebec ministry and say, well, the Pagoda people are which you've ordered up, 150, 200 families, will be starting up next week. And he said, what the hell are you talking about? With a much better accent than I had, of course. And he said, our language training facilities are overstretched now. The unions there are giving us a lot of trouble. We've never heard of this. So I called Naomi and I said, I'm going to send you another 150 families through the back door. Are you ready to take them? And Naomi, of course, just groaned and said, yes, of course, we'll take them. But so there were some complications there. In the field, I think the Quebec immigration officers work beside ours, and the folklore is, and I suspect it's true, that when the Quebec guys got through doing what they needed to do, they would interview the federal cases, and when the Quebec guys were falling behind, the feds would interview their cases, and we just sort of fake the documentation on both sides and get on with it with that kind of enterprising spirit that we saw demonstrated the other day. But it added a dimension of complication. Once we sorted out where who we had to deal with, things were much better. The other thing that complicated Quebec's problem, and I'll just say it, was that they had a fantastic system of language training facilities for incoming immigrants and refugees. Really good, but they were finite. And they gave people long amounts of training, like 9-10 months. Well, it didn't take very long for this system to get completely backed up. And that impeded their ability to take new people into the country. Huleen.
I can't help but thinking about that quote, that we live two lives, that of our own and that of our times. And I've really appreciated hearing a bit of the contextual analysis, what was happening at the time. One of the factors that I used to believe, and it may not be true, but I wonder about, is historically my understanding is that at the times that Canada accepted large groups of immigrants and refugees were always a correlation with a time when our labor market needed workers. And so I know when I was reflecting on this in terms of the work in Kitchener-Waterloo, we had a really vibrant, diverse economy, and we worked closely with business because they needed and wanted people. We could find jobs for them. So one of my reflections was, if that is true, and in looking at my notes and thinking about the labor market at that time, or more my husband thinking about the labor market at that time, was what's in place today is what we have, which I think is a travesty, and goes against every fundamental Canadian value that I hold dear, and that's the foreign worker program. We have had in the past, if you come as a refugee, you can work, and you may have to live in poor conditions, you may have to take jobs none of us ever want to do, but in return, you can become a citizen, and you can become and shape who we as Canadians are. That doesn't exist anymore. So whether it's in the McDonald's or whether it's in the agricultural fields, we have thousands of people, and they're invisible. So I would just say, for the people who have inspired me at this conference, the Annas and the Evelyns and the Yasmins, who are working in a context that's so much more difficult, we can't repeat what happened then. Lots was easy for us because of what was happening. But we so need you to do the analysis of what is happening. What policies do we need to change now? What is our role as those of us who have retired, who did that action throughout our lives continuously? Is there a role we can play, not to say this is maybe what you can do? How do we help you form the networks that you need? How do we give you the encouragement to stay in a civil service that is so dehumanizing right now? So from the bottom of my heart, I want to, number one, say thank you to all of you who are of the generation who will shape who we are becoming. Thank you for being here. For those of us who still have some contacts, I ask us to look at the foreign worker program and how it maybe is having a negative impact on refugees as well.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I've just received word that our noon hour speaker should be here in about 10 minutes. So what we have in mind is that Vincent Lam, Dr. Vincent Lam, who is of course one of our brightest new novelists, is coming and will give us a reading from his book that reflects some of what we've been talking about. But we have a few minutes before then. I think our guests from the United Nations, High Commissioner for Refugees, would like to say a word because I know he has to depart. But when that's done, I will say just in advance our thanks to this panel, to the movers and shakers that shaped what we did, and we will. I would suggest people do what you have to do. Pick up a delicious boxed lunch, and so that we can be ready to listen when Dr. Lam comes. Udo, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mike. And this is precisely why I wanted to take the floor, because I really regret that I have to leave after the lunch. But I better get back to New York because my big boss from Geneva is arriving there on Sunday, and I better get ready for that. But I wanted to add one dimension that came out of Howard's excellent review of where this movement might have come from, or the elements that somehow or other played a role, because the reflection on, if you like, civil disobedience as a route to then form and channel that potential into a thematic issue of solidarity with a particular cause, for me, made the bridge to the human rights movement. And it's not very often that the humanitarian and the human rights movements speak to each other. I worked, as I said yesterday, for a number of years in Amnesty, and I must say the potential of that movement contributing to this sort of practical solidarity that was evident in the response to the Indo-Chinese movement may have played a bigger role than we even contemplate or know, because clearly 1 million people out there at the time who were members of Amnesty. I remember the very camp that was referred to this morning in Hong Kong, Tai Chau, was a camp where the Hong Kong Correctional Services Department had a very heavy-handed regime, to say, and quite often this resulted in really sort of militaristic style, punitive action for disobedience in the camp among the population, which from time to time really escalated and resulted in walking the gauntlet type activities where people got their collarbones broken, ribs broken, really severe punishment amounting to torture or cruel and human degrading treatment at least. I remember on one of my trips to Hong Kong as Amnesty International, I released what is known in the Amnesty jargon as an urgent action. I don't know whether any one of you have ever worked with Amnesty, but an urgent action really is quite something. You would not know that the government in question had all faxes of the Interior Ministry, the Prosecutor General's office, the Governor's office blocked with immediate effect the moment that urgent action came out. This was just the first response in 48 hours, which conservatively, in Amnesty terms, generates about 50 to 80,000 responses to the particular government in question. And thereafter, or in parallel, a letter writing campaign then starts, which really can literally be in the tens of thousands of letters on a particular individual, which so often I have heard individuals telling me really were life-saving measures and really made a difference in an individual's life. What you never hear normally is what the government does with that sort of response. And I remember 2 weeks after I left Amnesty and joined UNHCR again in Hong Kong, the government representative who was the head of the special branch called me in and said he wants to show me something. And he showed me a whole corridor of computer stations set up with 10 staff dedicated to do nothing else but answering Amnesty letters that had come in, that had been classified, had been stamped, properly recorded, and about 10,000 had already been answered to individually. And he pleaded that I please stop the wave of letters coming to the Hong Kong government to complain about this one incident in Tai Chau. I really think this is the kind of spirit that we are talking about, to move beyond this sort of feeling of being totally unable to contribute one way or another to a particular cause, and to really join forces with those that really feel we can make a difference if we all get together and we just get off our bum and become active in embracing an issue. Thank you.